Welcome to another edition of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. Well, it's been a while since we checked in with Dan Kelly, the president and CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. His organization is the voice of small business in this country, and with the COVID restrictions still a reality, inflation raging, and other challenges, there's lots to talk about. Dan, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you, Tony.
Let's take a broad approach with the first question. I'd love to get your assessment of the state of small business in our country.
Look, it is brutal once again. Just over the course of the fall of 2021, businesses were starting to see a tiny bit of light at the end of this long COVID tunnel, only to have that snatched away with Omicron restrictions and lockdowns and all the rest of it. Up until that point, we were starting to see some divergence. For about half of the economy, half of small businesses, they were starting to turn their attention to other issues like inflationary pressures and supply chain issues. But the other half, especially retail, hospitality, the service sector, arts and entertainment, travel, tourism, those sectors, it was pandemic. But of course, now, as we are in January 2022, businesses once again in a ton of industries are seeing just a huge sap of consumer confidence as a result of Omicron, and now new business restrictions that are really killing some of the businesses that have survived this far.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it too, the consumer confidence. That's the part you don't really necessarily think about right away, but if people are just feeling hunkered down or locked down, personally themselves, they're not going to be doing a lot of purchasing.
No, they're sure not. Or if they are doing purchasing, it's going to be to a few of the sectors that have been really left unscathed by the restrictions. Those, obviously big online players, they've done quite well through this. The small local independents, those are the ones that have just been hurt like crazy. And consumer spending is on different things than it is through the pandemic. It's not so much on dining and entertainment and travel. It is on hard goods or a new jacuzzi for your backyard. I mean, these are some of the bigger purchases that are happening. And so there are some firms that have been helped by that. For my membership, about 7% have said that they have been as well off or better off through the pandemic, and a full half have said that they're bleeding, and many, I think about a third, are losing money every single day that they remain open.
Is that right? And so, are you getting a sense? I know you have statistical analyses, as I'm sure anecdotal stories too. I mean, how close to the edge are some of these companies?
It's brutal. I mean, for many of them, I believe, the Omicron restrictions could be that straw that breaks the camel's back. Many, there have been a lot of zombie businesses that have just basically been frozen in time, hoping that they can survive on subsidies until such time as they're reunited with their customers. As that now has moved into a second, we've completed a second year nearabouts. These businesses are looking at their balance sheets, looking at their books, and saying, I don't see a pathway back to profitability. And if that doesn't happen soon, they are going to throw in the towel. Mm-hmm. Our estimate at CFIB is that 180,000 businesses, that's fully 1 in 6 small firms with paid staff, will close their doors forever as a result of the damage that they've taken on through the pandemic. And gosh, that number could go higher now that we're back into full lockdowns in parts of the country.
Yeah, it must be really tough. I think you mentioned this off the top with the hospitality sector in particular, because it just seemed, it seemed like a pretty good summer, but we're back to these old situations again, right?
We are, but I will say that even prior to Omicron, it was only about a third of small businesses that said that they were back to normal levels of sales. So consumers have not, there were all these predictions that there would be these big boom times coming out of the pandemic as we crawled out of our basements and spent our brains out. That really didn't happen.
No.
The dollar shifted, of course, to some industries over others, but gosh, you're not going to get your hair cut twice as often coming out of the pandemic. You're not going to go out to dine every night of the week. So businesses in these sectors that were deeply affected by physical distancing requirements or lockdowns, those losses are permanent, and for many of them, they were not seeing the customers even in less restrictive times. with Omicron restrictions, it's not just the restrictions themselves that are killing businesses, but the fear that this is sent through consumers with people just choosing to stay at home. That's hurting a lot of small firms too.
We're going to take a brief break, but we'll be right back with Dan Kelly. Stay with us. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dan Kelly. He is the president and CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Dan, you referenced this in the first segment about some of these other issues, inflation, supply chain issues. They are still plaguing businesses and people, and it doesn't seem to be going away. What are you hearing from your membership?
No, as I said before, about half of the businesses had pivoted away from pandemic to issues related to supply chain, the shortage of labor, another huge file for many small firms, and then supply chain issues and price hikes. Those were big pressures. I will add to that list. Governments, unfortunately, have not taken a break from adding their own cost pressures to small firms. Ontario increases the minimum wage. BC has added 5 days of employer-paid sick time. The federal government is increasing Canada pension plan premiums. The carbon taxes in many provinces are going to be rising quickly in the months ahead. I mean, governments should at least be pressing pause on some of the cost increases that they are imposing. The government of Canada is not going to be able to do much about the cost of a shipping container from Asia, but what they can do is at least on the cost issues that they control, taxes and regulatory policies, those are the ones that they could give a little bit of breathing room to small firms. They haven't chosen to do that.
Yeah, and is that part of your advocacy then with let's say the federal government, I guess the provincial governments as well, are you saying to sort of hold off on some of these things or to abandon them? What's your positioning?
Absolutely. Well, look, at minimum, we want the government to press pause on a lot of these cost hikes. So, even if one believes that the Canada Pension Plan premium should be going up over the next number of years, as is planned, I don't think it would kill the economy to put hold on that for a year or two to let people get back to some semblance of normal. Remember, the Canada Pension Plan premium that just went into effect on January 1st meant that every single Canadian's paycheck, net income, they went down, and every employer had to dig even deeper in their payroll budget.
Right.
We're seeing huge wage increases, largest wage increases in small business since we've been tracking them, close to 4% for many small businesses to try to address some of the shortage of labor issues. Now, the pandemic, Omicron has meant that for some sectors, the shortage of labor has temporarily gone away. Mm-hmm. Many of my members said, look, my labor market issue right now is laying off staff once again. I spoke to tons of business owners that were in tears over the holidays, having to announce further rounds of layoffs of staff just because governments have shut them down or put in place a 50% capacity restriction.
It's a strange time to be a small business because you've got these sort of conflicting pressures. You talked about laying off staff, but there's also, you've been referencing this a couple of times now, this huge competition to get staff, and tell us a little bit more about that, because I think that's really important.
Look, even prior to the pandemic, the shortage of labor was growing rapidly as a file. Many firms saying that they're just not seeing the new entrants into the labor force that they need, especially in some of the sectors at the more junior skill levels for retail, hospitality, the service sector. They depend often on a lot of new entrants, teenagers and young adults to fill those roles. And with Canada's declining birth rates, that labor pool has dried up. The savings grace, of course, for us as Canadians has been that we've had a large number of immigrants that have joined. That we had a temporary pause to that policy during the 2020 anyway, and so that has meant that the labor market has been just thrown into turmoil. I don't blame some of the workers to leave, say, the restaurant industry and others, because they've said, "Look, I've been locked down, rehired 2 or 3 times," and they're saying, nuts to this. I'm going to go and find another industry that at least provides me with more stability. That's not the business's fault. That's the government policies that have been put in place that have caused this labor market crunch. We're advocating right now that we should be dramatically increasing the temporary foreign worker program. I remember lobbying you on this years ago.
Yes, I recall those meetings. Yes,
but we need to be dramatically expanding that program, at least a temporary boost to the temporary foreign worker program to deal with the labor market crunch we're facing could be hugely helpful to small firms right now. It's one of the only levers we have to add bodies to the labor force in Canada that are desperately needed. I'm hoping that if we can get Omicron under control in the next few weeks, the lockdown restrictions and capacity controls, we hope, will be lifted. We're going to be then right back into the huge labor shortage that we were facing in earlier months, and that we need to address.
Yes, it's definitely not going away anytime soon. I agree with you on that. Dan Kelly is with us. He is the president and CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. We will continue our discussion with him right after these messages. Stay with us. And we're back here at Boom and Bust, here with Dan Kelly. He is the president and CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, basically Canada's voice for small businesses. Dan, I want to return just to the COVID restrictions just for a second. Obviously, we're entering year 3 of this pandemic now, and yet we're still using the same levers like lockdown, for instance. Is it time for a new approach? Is that part of what you're telling government to look at?
We are. Look, at some point, we're going to have a difficult choice to make as Canadians. It seems a choice that other countries are making right now. And that is, we can either let businesses reopen and try to safely serve the customers that they've depended on as their sources of income, continue to create jobs and keep the economy moving, or we can lock everyone down, restrict them with capacity restrictions. But if we do that, we've got to provide full economic supports to the businesses that are being deeply affected. And gosh, at some point that's going to bankrupt us as a nation if we continue to have to shovel money at everybody that is closed down. I look at what's happening in other jurisdictions. Yes, they're dealing with Omicron pressures. Yes, there are strains on the hospital system, and we can talk about that another time. But I gotta say, they are finding different pathways. Lockdowns are not being used indiscriminately. Ontario still, I believe, at the end of this, will have the reputation as having had the longest lockdowns in the entire world. Businesses have already been locked down for more than 400 days, closed for 400 days so far over the course of the past 2 years, and that the clock has started ticking once again. We can't keep doing this and then expecting businesses to just hang on and eat the losses themselves.
Yeah, and I don't know whether this is actually happening, but there's certainly at least more talk about defiance. I'm not encouraging anything, I'm just observing. When you talk to gym owners, for instance, people who own gyms are starting to say, look, we just can't go on this way. We're going to take the hit and reopen or something like that. Are you getting that sense as well?
Oh, yeah. Look, the business population is really tired of these restrictions. And some of them are saying, look, my business is going to fail, or I could put it open again or find a creative way of doing that and have a chance of surviving. And I ask the public, if your income was eviscerated, if your income was ground down to zero for 2 years, what would you do? Would you say, okay, I guess I just got to suck it up and continue to eat these losses as long as I can? I've talked to members in tears who are losing their home because it was mortgaged to get the business going, who are putting their payroll on their personal credit card or have depleted their entire retirement savings. They don't have pensions to draw on, but all of the money they've set aside for the business owner's retirement is wiped out as a result of trying to keep the business afloat. So it's easy to judge business owners that are at the point of desperation where they take these steps. I can understand why they do, but I got to say, at this stage, it's not justifying lockdowns that would be many have said, look, Dan, you should be organizing mass protests, civil disobedience to try to get businesses open. I guess I would say to them, we could do that, but governments have scared the pants off of the public. Yeah. And so many consumers, whether the business is open or not, are just not going because they are sitting in their basement afraid.
Yeah, I know that's part of it too, obviously. And let's face it, if you're like me and like our audience, everybody knows someone who's had Omicron in the last 2 weeks. It,
Yeah.
it at least feels that way anyway. So, there's obviously some care. And I want to be clear. I'm not saying businesses are saying we want to open with no restrictions and no COVID protocols. They want to be safe for their customers, but they want to be open. That's basically the point.
You got it. And look, Ontario, again, is the only province that's used blanket lockdowns once again. There are other provinces have reached other decisions. The rest of the world seems to be finding other decisions to try to combat COVID. The vast majority of businesses have complied with every single rule, regardless of how stupid it is, to try to address the pandemic. But gosh, this is wearing thin. And at some point, the public health officials and governments are going to lose the room with the public and I'd say business owners, and that's happening in a lot of cases.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point because they need legitimacy and credibility to ask people to do extraordinary things, and if that isn't there, because we're in year 3 or because some of these restrictions seem a little bit nonsensical after a while, that's a problem that government has to solve in the future. We're going to return with our guest, Dan Kelly, President and CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, after this break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dan Kelly, the President and CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Dan, can 2022 still be a good year for business, do you think? Are there some silver linings or some sunshine amongst the clouds?
Gosh, I'm sure hoping, but our economic data is sadly suggesting quite the opposite for
right?
small firms. The optimism seems to be vanishing fast. Businesses are more pessimistic. They're dealing with not just the crush of COVID issues, but all the other cost pressures that we spoke about a little bit earlier. This is not a good time for entrepreneurs, and governments, unfortunately, are making it in some cases worse rather than better. I will say that we are starting to get some signs that Ontario was very close to pivoting to a live with COVID strategy.
Yeah.
That was, and then they pivoted away from that real fast. But I'm hoping we can get them back to thinking of how can we continue to keep meaningful restrictions, light restrictions in place to guard against the vestiges of the pandemic, while allowing life to return slowly and steadily back to normal. If we can do that in the weeks ahead, I'm hoping that we will come through without massive casualties. But again, just from an Ontario context, the lockdowns were put in place for a 3-week period. There's not a lot of confidence based on the last 2 years that they will be lifted within 3 weeks. And that's what we're facing. How long can businesses live with the degree of uncertainty that they have taken on?
Yeah, no, and I think it's all tied to the rate of hospitalizations. If they start to dip, as they have done in South Africa and just recently in the UK, hospitalizations in London, UK have dipped finally, so they might be cresting there. If we had any evidence of that in the near future, that could animate discussions. I know you talked about hospitalization, but that's got to be the key metric, right?
It really does. Look, everybody's admitting that the case count number is absolutely meaningless at this stage, and we should have long ago pivoted to looking at hospitalizations. Yes, that has ticked up too, and we have to take that seriously. But this incredibly limited capacity for Canada to deal with a few hundred cases in our ICUs just seems crazy to me. Over the course of the past 2 years, yes, I know you can't turn the healthcare system on a dime, but we have had 2 years where we should be in better spot for testing. We should be in much better shape with respect to hospitalization capacity and senior care. Had we worked on some of those things in earlier phases of this, earlier waves of the pandemic, perhaps we wouldn't have needed to take these draconian measures as many provinces have. We pulled kids out of school in many provinces, delayed their starts, closed down the economy, put capacity restrictions in place. Vaccine passports remain in all sorts of areas. Gosh, the list goes on, and I'm not sure how much longer we can take the burden that has been imposed on the small business community of Canada.
That's another good point. Obviously, whenever schools close down, that affects small business owners disproportionately because they're not big companies. They've got to look after their kids.
It's very true. School closing has been a huge file. Omicron, of course, has led to an increase in the number of people, as you pointed out. We all know people who have Omicron now. I knew virtually no one who had COVID in the 4 earlier waves, but I know tons of people and staff that have been affected by it in this current wave. It is good that governments across Canada have limited the number of days of isolation to 5 instead of pulling everybody out for 2 weeks. That was helpful. But with that affecting the labor market, there are and school closures affecting others to be able to attend in person. It is really tough to keep a business open with spontaneous closures happening all the time in small and medium-sized companies.
Well, here's hoping we turn a corner soon and there's no incoming train around that corner. I'm making light of it, but I know how serious it is. Dan Kelly, President and CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Tony.
All the best. Well, obviously, Dan Kelly, who's speaking on behalf of small businesses throughout Canada, has his finger on the pulse of what small businesses are thinking and what they're going through. It's not a pretty scene right now. I don't want to sugarcoat it. Inflation and supply chain and labor shortages, and now current restrictions that have gone on. So everybody's struggling, but hopefully around the corner it'll be a little bit better. That's my hope, at least anyway. I'm sure it's your hope as well. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.